We have callers waiting to talk with you. We'll start with Joe, who's in Texas on the line for Democrats. Good morning, Joe.
This is
Joe, are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here. You got me?
Yes.
Hear me?
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, I want to ask this lady, do you think you're going to get a true draft report down to Trump and fire the fellow since he did a report that he didn't like? I believe every time something don't go the way he wanted to go, he fire everyone. So now, and people can keep on believing everything Trump tell you, and you're going to fool around and he's going to bankrupt the United States where he did all his businesses.
So, as you mentioned, one of the things that happened yesterday is that President Trump did fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics later in the day after we got this jobs data, and President Trump basically said that he thinks that the numbers were wrong, and we can talk about that too, about how the BLS calculates its data, but I would say that it's still sort of unclear now what that means for the agency. People who, economists who rely on this data and investors who rely on this data and, people who were at the BLS previously, the person who ran BLS during Trump's first term, you're seeing a lot of people really express concern about this and the idea that he might put someone in there who isn't going to necessarily approach the statistical aspects of this job with as much independence as the BLS has been set up to do. But we don't know that yet because we don't know exactly, we don't know who they're putting in there. And, it's definitely something that people are watching very closely.
Victoria, explain how they come up with the job numbers. You just alluded to it, but how they come up with the jobs numbers, as well as what we saw with the revisions in previous reports, how those happen and how common they are, how common it is to have revisions in past reports.
So the way that the BLS calculates these numbers is based on surveys. So they talk to households and they talk to businesses. And, when they talk to businesses, they track their employment over time, how many positions they have, whether they've added some, whether they've subtracted some, what kind of jobs they've added. And they have, they send out these surveys to businesses across the country. Obviously, they are not polling every single business in the entire country. That would not be possible. And so there's also some economic assumptions that you have to put into that. For example, they have to have a good sense of how many businesses exist in the country, right? How many workers? This has been an interesting question under President Joe Biden when we saw a big jump in immigration of what is the worker base? And so there's a lot of complexity to what the BLS has to do. And, from month to month, they sometimes get survey responses from businesses after they've initially reported the information. And there's also a bunch of other additional data that they get that might affect the number. So the revisions themselves are completely normal. The BLS regularly updates the numbers in subsequent months. The thing that was really striking about this report is the revisions were quite large. And another thing I'll note is that the BLS also has had staffing shortages. There's been a hiring freeze. And that has also limited their ability to deal with the fact that response rates from businesses have gone down since the pandemic. And, it's a little bit harder to address that, where you need to sort of follow up and find, the proper responses that you need without the proper staffing.
Victoria, Ben in Arlington, Virginia, sent us a text with this question. Is it true that most of the prices used for the CBI are now just guesses and inflation could worse than assumed? We don't have enough accurate data under Trump.
So most of the prices are not assumed, but, I do think that there is, the caller is referring to something that it's called imputation, where there are certain prices that factor into the consumer price index that are not observable prices. So, for example, there's something called owner equivalent rent, where so there's rent, which is an observable price, right? Like there are people out there who are charging rent. But there's also housing costs that are faced by homeowners. And one of the ways that number is included in the CPI is through owner equivalent rent, which is basically like if you had your house up for rent, what would it go for, right? And that kind of data is a little bit, more based on imputation, as they call it. But that's not like the majority of CPI. I mean, it's consumer prices. So they're largely looking at prices that are faced by consumers. There's also something called the personal consumption expenditures index, which is another key inflation metric, and that looks at a broader range of prices, including things like health insurance that's paid for by your employer, and so both of these kind of give you different snapshots of price pressures in the economy. But to answer the question, no, it's not like they're just making stuff up.
Let's talk with Roy in Greensboro, North Carolina, line for Democrats. Good morning, Roy.
Thank you so much. I've been noticing a lot lately. This is anecdotal evidence of a declining job market. But for one thing, the restaurants I like to go to, one's a seafood restaurant my sister works at, and their business is just like falling off a cliff. It's terrible business now. I guess people are holding on to their money. They've laid off people. And a couple of Mexican restaurants I like that you usually had to wait to get a booth. They have practically nobody in them. Even the Walgreens that I go to, it has hardly any customers. I think it's obvious that the job market is declining. Like a caller said a few callers ago, Trump is going to do what he did to all his businesses, run them into the ground. That's what he's doing. That's what he's done. It'll get ready for a real depression here.
So, we have, obviously the United States is a very large country, and so we might see different job market trends that look a little bit different in every place. But one of the things that we have seen across the country is, based on data from the Bank of America Institute, which looks at aggregate bank account data, we have seen declines in spending, particularly from people who are on the lower income end, where they're spending less money on discretionary things like restaurants, because they're spending a lot more on things like rent, which has obviously gone up a lot over the last few years. And so that's something to really watch for, as you were indicating, because economic activity is ultimately really driven by consumer spending. And it's all kind of tied together where, if you have businesses do well when people spend there, and so they're able to employ people. And when people are employed, they're able to keep spending. So everything is kind of connected to each other.
Victoria, the caller listing off some places where he's seen changes in the workforce, and we talked about job sectors that were hardest hit in recent reports. Are there areas that have seen above average hiring or no changes?
Healthcare has seen the biggest amount of hiring. It's consistently been an area of growth. And as I think I mentioned at the top, it's actually this past month, it was, other than social assistance, I think the only sector that by itself net added jobs. It will be very interesting to see the data going forward. Obviously, as I mentioned before, we don't know who the next head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to be. But presumably the process will not change. I guess we'll have to see how that plays out. But we'll have to see whether, that trend continues of other sectors net losing jobs.
Let's hear from Bruce in Maryland, line for independence. Hi, Bruce.
Good morning. Considering that the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics, Trump liked the statistics the day before, but now when he got the ones he doesn't like, she's suddenly doing a bad job. Do you think if he hires somebody that is not doing it correctly, are there other ways to derive that data?
Great question. This is actually something that Fed Chair Powell was asked about at his press conference, not in the context of anything to do with President Trump, but because of what I was mentioning earlier, which is sort of the statistical challenges of what the BLS has to do and the fact that they have, staffing shortages, less response rates. And there are private sources of data. So, for example, during the pandemic, a lot of people really turned to, there are things like ADP, which is a private payroll company that I think it's something like a quarter of the workforce or a quarter of companies. And so that gives you a snapshot. There's also data from Homebase that gives you some employment data. You can look at, Indeed to get senses of hiring and, job postings and things like that. And they have all sorts of statistical ways of trying to estimate what's happening in the economy. But what you hear consistently from Chair Powell and also from just economists in general that really rely on this data is that there's no good, perfect substitute for the data we get from the government. I mean, this is something that actually, other countries, not all other countries, but like many other countries don't have access to this, high quality of information about what is happening in the labor market. And so it's really something that we maybe take for granted here, that we have this kind of data and this kind of snapshot into what's happening in the economy.
Victoria, on the topic of the jobs report, Donald in South Bend, Indiana, sent in this question, asked Ms. Guida if moving the report of the jobs numbers be pushed to the middle of the month to give a more accurate number instead of the first Friday of the new month.
So I don't really have a sense of whether certain weeks of the month offer a more, a better snapshot than others. But the survey week, I think, is in the middle of the month, and then it's reported because then they have to go through the data, and it's reported at the beginning of the month. But unfortunately, I can't speak to, whether that timing is better or worse than it should be.
Sharon in Aloha, Oregon, line for Democrats. Good morning, Sharon.
Hello. I have a couple of questions that since we got an expert here, she can help me with. Okay, with the jobs report, yesterday's thing was down 25% of projection. In other reports, like earlier in other administrations, that would be seen as a big, dump. But you're saying that it really wasn't? It's not that big a deal, 25%?
So, yeah, it's a great question. The thing is, there is, as we were sort of talking about, right, there's usually revisions at the later that you get. And actually, eventually, that we actually get hard data on how much employment there is. It just takes a while. It takes I think it's like a year. So eventually you can literally go back and see more about the accuracy of the BLS's data. And this is, you might remember what happened last year when there was a huge revision in August, and this usually happens in August, and that's because they got a lot of hard data that they didn't have before on employment numbers. But in terms of a miss, something like 25,000 jobs, when you consider the churn of the U.S. economy, I mean, at any given time, in a given month, there's roughly 6 million people leaving their job and 6 million people getting hired. And then the net number is what you see. And so something like 25,000 difference is not that large. There's also some margin of error. And so, something like that level of a miss it is not that unusual to have it like 73,000 instead of, I think it was 104. But obviously the base number matters, right? And the fact that it was it was only 73,000, that's something that's getting closer to where the margin of error is just kind of like, it's unclear whether we added jobs at all, right? And so that's one of the reasons why it's something to watch really closely. The last thing I'll say here is we also are in a situation in the economy right now, as I mentioned earlier, where demand for workers is slowing, but also supply of workers is slowing because of the immigration crackdown. And so in order to sustain the employment rate, the economy doesn't actually need to add as many jobs. And so that's another reason why you kind of have to look at the whole picture, and something like adding 73,000 jobs, isn't enough to cause like crazy amounts of concern right now.
Sharon, did you have a second question for Victoria?
Yes, I did, if I could. Okay, because the other question is, the tariffs have gone in, and that will cause prices to go up. The Procter & Gamble has already said they're going to raise Tide and Dawn, and Walmart says they're going to raise prices. Target does. We're already seeing it at Costco. And in the tariffs, we have now come to learn that we, the people, pay them, just like Procter & Gamble raising the taxes or raising the prices. And so my question is that the people that really get hit with that are the middle class and the poor, because the poor spend 100% of their income just to live. The middle class spend a lot more than the very rich. And so what that's doing is, in effect, the tariffs are really a tax on the poor and the middle class through raising the cost, the prices. And then they talk about if inflation goes up, and it is, because Procter & Gamble, they're all saying they're going to raise chocolate. Everybody's raising their prices. At the same time, if these jobs numbers continue to go down, what will that mean for our economy?
This is exactly what the Fed is worried about, the situation that you just described. Some people may remember that in the 1970s, we experienced something known as stagflation, which is basically where you have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. And, we're not in that place right now. Unemployment is at 4.2%, which is quite low. And, inflation has ticked up. As I mentioned, we have seen some price increases, and as you mentioned, we have seen some price increases as a result of the tariffs. But so far, it hasn't been a large jump. But the concern is that we will see both of those effects, where inflation is pushing up, and everything else is slowing. Now, the way that could just play out is that the slowing is enough to kind of make inflation not so much of a concern in terms of economic growth, because this gets a little confusing, right? But like the inflation that the Fed is worried about is sustained price increases, as opposed to just, okay, businesses are leveling up their prices one time in response to tariffs. That's not something that the Fed can really do anything about or stop. What they're worried about is a situation where prices go up because of tariffs, and maybe they keep going up because of tariffs, either because the policy is really dragged out in how it's implemented over time, or because things just get more expensive for businesses, and so they keep having to raise their prices, and then they also then have to pay their workers more because their workers are having to spend more money, and then that leads to a situation where everything just keeps going up. But also, the economy could just slow to where if you're spending more money on things that you need to spend money on, food, gas, rent, things like that, and then you don't have enough money left over for a lot of other stuff, which then just, instead of being able to sustain price increases, just leads to a slowdown or even recession in the sort of worst case scenario.
Let's hear from Shirley in Alabama on the line for Democrats. Good morning, Shirley.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for the program, and thank Miss Victoria for her information. I call about the economy because I go from day to day. I don't have any kids in school, have grandchildren, great-grands, but I look at the parents that have children that they have to feed every day, they have to clothe every day, and the working-class families are really struggling. I believe that the last job information for May and June was not accurate. I think it was fudged to make the president look good. July is more accurate. I see they went back and did some corrections. But I need to ask her, what am I supposed to look at to judge the prices of the everything because of tariffs? I see everything going up. I'm in a small town. There's no stores. Drive 35, 40 miles to Walmart. Walmart went up on their prices when the president first announced the tariffs. I don't know if anybody was watching except me, but the prices are already up. So could you ask her, what are we supposed to look at to judge the economy, whether it's going up or down, when day to day people are struggling and suffering? Thank you. I'll wait on her answers.
So I think what you're asking is, how do you judge whether tariffs are pushing up prices as opposed to whatever else is going on? I'll come back to your jobs point. You do, to an extent, you get some direct explanations from businesses themselves on earnings calls. You know, when executives talk to their shareholders, and they're actually bound by SEC rules to not be misleading to investors in explaining their strategy. So, a lot of them will talk about tariffs and the extent to which that might drive price increases. It's a little bit hard to always know exactly, though. Obviously, businesses have had a bit more power to raise prices lately. For a very long time, we didn't see significant inflation. And then when you get to a situation where, like the pandemic where we saw shortages, it was kind of hard to separate out how much of that was because they saw increased costs and how much of it was because they also had a little bit of wiggle room to raise prices. And so I feel like you'll probably see a similar dynamic here with the tariffs. But it's also not totally surprising where the tariff price increases might come. I mentioned earlier things like apparel, which is heavily imported, and so it's not surprising that would be an industry that is particularly affected by tariffs. In terms of where to look for data, I mean, the government does put out a lot of really high quality data. It's not even just from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We also have the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that all put out a lot of data. But I will also mention, I mean, the U.S. economy is huge. This is a huge country, and it's not simple and it's not straightforward to get a sense necessarily of what is happening across the economy. And there's regional trends, there's local trends where the things that certain parts of the economy are experiencing is different from what other parts of the economy are experiencing. So it's a very difficult thing to constantly have to try and figure out.
Clarence is in North Carolina on the line for Republicans. Good morning, Clarence.
Yeah, good morning. How's everyone? I'm listening to everyone. I stay here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Walmart, I go to Walmart every other day. I'm retired. It's packed every time I go into Walmart. I don't see the prices going up because I shop there every day. Matter of fact, the economy here in Charlotte is booming. More houses. Matter of fact, to get a home here in Charlotte, you got to at least have $500,000 because so many people are moving here in North Carolina and South Carolina. Matter of fact, I'm getting ready to buy me another house down in South Carolina. The economy here is booming. They got jobs open everywhere I go. All the people here, if you want a job, you can get a job. I sat here and I listened to the people say the economy is bad. And I'm retired. I'm retired. My money is great. I get over $6,000 a month. I can work if I want to. I'm over 65. I'm 72 years old. I'm a black man. I don't see more black folks are moving here on homes than I ever seen. Just met a man move here from New York City. He said he didn't know black folks that own homes till he came here to Charlotte, North Carolina. And I told him one of the best economy in the world right now, I think, is here. So when I hear people complaining about the economy back, I'm just, where they stay at? What are they going through? And I realize most of the people are senior people. And I understand they doesn't work and it's high everywhere you go. The rent is high and buy a home is bad, but the economy here is booming. So move to Charlotte. If you having that much problem, I promise you, it'll be a blessing if you move here. So God bless you. And put God first.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It's good to hear Charlotte is doing well. As I mentioned, it all of these experiences can be true. This is a large economy. There are a lot of different places that people live and have a lot of different experiences. I mean, it is really interesting where this question of moving to places where the jobs are. We did during and after the pandemic see a lot of people move, and that's created, to an extent, in some places, a housing problem, because now there isn't necessarily enough supply of housing in the places where people want to live, and that's contributed to an affordability problem. Of course, also, some people don't have the ability to move for various reasons, whether it's because of their job or maybe they're, caring for an aging parent or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think that also the nature of this economy is that some places are always going to be doing better than others.
Bernie is in Louisville, Kentucky, line for Democrats. Good morning, Bernie.
Morning, Tammy. Good morning, Victoria. I had a question about the jobs numbers. Are you familiar with the term soft money? And do these numbers, do they include people who are hired using soft money? I don't know if you're familiar with what that means. People who are hired, full-time benefits, they're full-time employees, but they're paid through a certain grant or a project. And as long as that project or grant money is coming in, they have a job. But as soon as it leaves, the job goes with it too. Are they included in this the 73,000?
So the jobs report does include a lot of different types of formalized work arrangements, and some of them are temporary, and that's why So, for example, when we do the census every 10 years, you'll actually sometimes see a temporary jump in employment because people are being hired to be census workers. Yeah, I mean, I don't know all of the different categories because there are many of what is and isn't included, because there are some work arrangements that are harder for BLS to track, but they also ask households, right? So they can also get a sense in terms of employment without having to ask businesses themselves. So for people who are self-employed, for example, they would have to get that information from households. But yes, that kind of arrangement is captured.
Just a few minutes left. Let's hear from Tom in Maryland, line for Republicans. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I have two questions. One, when Trump first started with the tariffs, many economists said it would cause a recession. Are we in a recession yet? And if not, when do you figure out that we're going to? And how would you rate today's economy versus the economy of last year? Thank you.
All great questions. So the first thing I'll say is if we were in a recession right now, if we were entering a recession right now, we might not know yet. That is true at any time. I'm not just saying that for right now. It's that oftentimes these things seem obvious in retrospect as to when they started, but it's not always clear immediately. However, looking at the data, we do not seem to be in recession. As I mentioned, the unemployment rate is 4.2%. That's quite low. It would be extremely surprising if we were in a recession right now. And then you asked, he asked a question about tariffs. Oh, right. This is what I was going to say. You were saying that people were predicting the tariffs were going to cause a recession. So this is an interesting arc of events, because one of the things that happened was President Trump announced very high tariffs on April 2nd, what he called Liberation Day. And those tariffs were at such high levels that you saw a lot of economists saying this is going to cause a recession. So that was when we had in the wake of that, we had a lot of market turmoil. And then ultimately, even the bond market started to get a little shaky. And so at that time, the president then announced a pause of those higher rates. Now, we've had tariffs in the interim. He had that 10% baseline tariff. But the higher rates had been paused. Now, more recently, as you may know, this past week, he announced rates for most countries, some of which were negotiated, some of which weren't. Those are still not quite back to the Liberation Day levels. And so the reason why I bring that up is because it was the Liberation Day levels in particular that economists said this is going to cause a recession. The tariffs that we have now and that we are getting now as a result of these latest tariff rates that the president's announced are likely to slow growth, but it's unclear whether they're actually going to cause a recession. It seems like for a lot of corporations, they have healthy profit margins. Maybe they can absorb some of that. And the U.S. economy has been quite resilient. Just over the last few years, people have been predicting recession. The Fed was able to bring down inflation without causing a recession. That basically never happens. And it's a testament to sort of the resiliency of the U.S. economy and the U.S. consumer. And then the other question you asked was to compare this year's economy to last year's economy. So I would say this year's economy is quite similar to last year's economy, but with tariffs added in. So a lot of the impulses that have shifted as a result of tariffs. So, I think inflation is about having ticked back up a little bit, is now back to levels that it was last year, because it had cooled even more at the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of the year, the economy was better than it was last year or now in terms of inflation. In terms of the job market, it's pretty similar, actually. So I think that to the extent that we've seen big macro shifts, it's particularly as a result of tariffs and sort of general uncertainty about where the tariffs are going to land.
Victoria Guida is an economics correspondent for Politico. You can find her work online at politico.com. Victoria, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.